We are reading The Giver, page 27, about 3/4 of the way down. When you're an 8 and start your volunteer hour, you can try some at the nurturing center, Mother suggested. Yes, I think I will, Lily said. She knelt beside the basket. What did you say his name is? Gabriel? Hello, Gabriel, she said in a sing-song voice. And then she giggled. Oops, she whispered. I think he's asleep. I guess I better be quiet. Jonas turned to the school assignments on his desk. Some chance of that, he thought. Lily was never quiet. Probably she should hope for an assignment as a speaker so that she could sit in the office with a microphone all day, making announcements. He laughed silently to himself, picturing his sister droning on in the self-important voice that all the speakers seemed to develop, saying things like, "Attention! This is a reminder to females under 9 that their hair ribbons are to be neatly tied at all times." He turned towards Lily and noticed to his satisfaction that her ribbons were, as usual, undone and dangling. There would be an announcement like that quite soon, he felt certain, and it would be directly mainly at Lily, though her name, of course, would not be mentioned. Everyone would know. Everyone had known, he remembered with humiliation, that the announcement, "Attention, this is a reminder to male 11s that objects are not to be removed from the recreation area and that snacks are to be eaten, not hoarded," had been specifically directed at him. The day last month that he had taken the apple home. No one had mentioned it, not even his parents, because the public announcement had been sufficient to produce an appropriate remorse. He had, of course, disposed of the apple and made his apology to the recreation department the next morning before school. Jonas thought again about the incident. He was still bewildered by it, not by the announcement or the necessary apology. Those were standard procedures. He had deserved them. But by the incident in himself. He probably should have brought up his feelings of bewilderment that very evening when the family unit had shared their feelings of the day. But he had not been able to sort out or put words to the source of his confusion, so he just let it pass. It had happened during the recreation period when he had been playing with Asher. Jonas casually picked up an apple from the basket where the snacks were kept and had thrown it to his friend. Asher had thrown it back, and they had begun a simple game of catch. There had been nothing special about it. It was an activity that he had performed countless times. Throw, catch, throw, catch. It was effortless for Jonas, and even boring, though Asher enjoyed it, and playing catch was a required activity for Asher because it would improve his hand-eye coordination, which was not up to standards. But Jonas had noticed, following the path of the apples through the air with his eyes, that a piece of fruit had, well, this was the part he couldn't adequately understand. The apple had changed. Just for an instant, it had changed in mid-air. He remembered, and then it was in his hand, and he looked at it carefully, but it was the same apple, unchanged. The same size, same shape, perfect sphere, the same shade, about the same shade as his own tunic. There was absolutely nothing remarkable about that apple. He had tossed it back and forth between his hands a few times, then thrown it to Asher, and again, in the air, for an instant only, it had changed. It happened 4 times. Jonas had blinked, looked around, and then tested his eyesight, squinting at the small print of the identification badge on his tunic. He read his name quite clearly. He could also see Asher at the other end of the throwing area, and he had no problem catching the apple. Jonas had been completely mystified. "Ash," he had called, "does anything seem strange to you about the apple?" "Yes," Asher called back, laughing. "It jumps out of my hands onto the ground." Asher had just dropped it once again. So Jonas laughed too, and with his laughter tried to ignore his uneasy conviction that something had happened. But he had taken the apple home, against the recreation area rules. That evening before his parents and Lily arrived at the dwelling, he held it in his hands and he looked at it carefully. It was slightly bruised now because Asher had dropped it several times, but there was nothing at all unusual about the apple. He had held a magnifying glass to it. He had tossed it several times across the room, watching it, and then rolled it around and around on his desktop, waiting for the thing to happen again. But it hadn't. The only thing that happened was the announcement later that evening over the speaker. The announcement that had singled him out without using his name, that had caused both of his parents to glance meaningfully at his desk where the apple still lay. Now sitting at his desk, staring at his schoolwork as his family hovered over the new child in its basket, he shook his head, trying to forget about the odd incident. He forced himself to arrange his papers and tried to study a little before the evening meal. The new child, Gabriel, stirred and whimpered, and Father spoke softly to Lily, explaining the feeding procedure as he opened the container that held the formula and equipment. The evening proceeded as all evenings did in the family unit, in the dwelling, in the community. Quiet, reflective, a time for renewal and preparation for the day to come. It was different only in the addition to it of the new child and his pale, solemn, knowing eyes. Jonas rode at his leisurely pace, glancing at the bike sports beside the building to see if he could spot Asher's. He didn't often do his volunteer hours with his friend Asher because he frequently fooled around and made serious work a little difficult. But now, the 12s coming soon and the volunteer hour ending, it didn't seem to matter. The freedom to choose where to spend those hours had always seemed a wonderful luxury to Jonas. The hours of the day were so carefully regulated. He remembered when he became an 8, as Lily would do shortly, and he had been faced with the freedom of choice. The 8s always set out on their first volunteer hour a little nervously, giggling and staying in groups of friends. They almost invariably did their hours on recreation duty first, helping the younger ones in the place where they still felt comfortable. But with guidance, as they developed self-confidence and maturity, they moved on to other jobs, gravitating towards those that would suit their own interests and skills. A male 11 named Benjamin had done his entire 4 years at the rehabilitation center working with citizens who had been injured. It was rumored that he was as skilled now as the rehabilitation directors themselves, and that he even developed some machines and methods to hasten rehabilitation. There was no doubt that Benjamin would receive his assignment to that field and would probably be permitted to bypass most of the training. Jonas was impressed by the things that Benjamin had achieved. He knew him, of course, since they had always been group mates, but they had never talked about the boy's accomplishments because such a conversation would have been awkward for Benjamin. There was never any comfortable way to mention or discuss one's success without breaking the rule against bragging, even if one didn't mean to. It was a minor rule, rather like rudeness punishable by only gentle chastisement, but still better to steer clear of an occasion governed by a rule which would be so easy to break. The area of dwellings behind him, Jonas rode past the community structures, hoping to spot Asher's bicycle parked beside one of the small factories or office buildings. He passed the child care center where Lily stayed after school and the play area surrounding it. He rode through the central plaza and a large auditorium where public meetings were held. Jonas slowed and looked at the name tags on the bicycles lined up outside the nurturing center. And then he checked those outside food distribution. It was always fun to help the deliveries, and he hoped that he would find his friend there so that he could go together on their daily rounds, carrying the cartons of supplies into dwellings of the community. But he finally found Asher's bicycle leaning, as usual, instead of upright in its port as it should have been, at the house of the old. There was only one other child's bicycle there, that of a female 11 named Fiona. Jonas liked Fiona. She was a good student, quiet and polite. She had a sense of fun as well, and it didn't surprise him that she was working with Asher today. He parked his bicycle neatly near the port beside theirs and entered the building. "Hello, Jonas," the attendant at the front desk said. She handed him the sign-up sheet and stamped her own official seal beside his signature. All of his volunteer hours would be carefully tabulated at the Hall of Open Records. Once long ago, it was whispered among the children that an 11 arrived at the ceremony of 12 only to hear a public announcement that he had not completed the required number of volunteer hours and would not, therefore, be given his assignment. He had been permitted an additional month to which to complete his hours, and then given his assignment privately, with no applause, no celebration, a disgrace that had clouded his entire future. It's good to have some volunteers here today," the attendant told him. "We celebrated a release this morning. and that always throws the schedule off a little bit, so things get backed up. She looked at the printed sheet. Let's see, Asher and Fiona are helping in the bathing room. Why don't you join them there? You know where it is, don't you? Jonas nodded, thanked her, and walked down the long hallway. He glanced into the rooms on either side. The old were sitting quietly. Some were visiting and talking to one another, others doing handwork and simple crafts. A few were asleep. Each room was comfortably furnished, the floors covered with thick carpeting. It was a serene, slow-paced place, unlike the busy centers of manufacture and distribution where the daily work of the community occurred. Jonas was glad that he had, over the years, chosen to do his hours in a variety of places so that he could experience the differences. He realized, though, that not focusing on one area meant he was left with not the slightest idea, or even a guess, of what his assignment would be. He laughed softly, thinking about the ceremony again. Jonas, he teased himself, but he suspected that with the date so near, probably all his friends were too. He passed a caretaker walking slowly with one of the olds in the hall. Hello, Jonas, the young uniformed man said, smiling pleasantly. The woman beside him, whose arm he held, was hunched over as she shuffled along in her soft slippers. She looked toward Jonas and smiled, but her dark eyes were clouded and blank. He realized she was blind. He entered the bathing room with its warm, moist air and scent of cleansing lotion. He removed his tunic, hung it carefully on a wall, and put the volunteer's smock on that was folded on a shelf. Hi, Jonas, Asher called from the corner where he was kneeling beside a tub. Jonas saw Fiona nearby at a different tub. She looked up and smiled at him, but she was busy, gently washing a man who lay in warm water. Jonas greeted them and the caretaking attendants who worked nearby. Then he went to the row of padded lounge chairs where others of the old were waiting. He had worked there before. He knew what to do. Your turn, Larissa, he said, reading the name tag on the woman's robe. I'll start the water and then help you up. He pressed the button on a nearby empty tub and watched as the warm water flowed through the many small openings in the sides. The tub would be filled in a minute and the water flow would stop automatically. He helped the woman from her chair, led her to the tub, removed her robe, and steadied her with his hand on her arm as she stepped in and lowered herself. She leaned back and sighed with pleasure, her head on a soft cushioned headrest. Comfortable, he asked, as she nodded, her eyes closed. Jonas squeezed cleansing lotion onto the clean sponge at the edge of the tub and began to wash her frail body. Last night, he had watched his father bathe the new child. This was much the same. The fragile skin, the soothing water, the gentle motion of his hand, slippery with soap. The relaxing, peaceful smile on the woman's face reminded him of Gabriel being bathed. And the nakedness, too. It was against the rules for children or adults to look at another's nakedness, but the rule did not apply to new children or the old. Jonas was glad. It was a nuisance to keep oneself covered up while changing for games, and a required apology if one had by mistake glimpsed another's body was always awkward. He couldn't see why it was necessary. He liked the feeling of safety here in the warm and quiet room. He liked the expression of trust on the woman's face as she lay in the water, unprotected, exposed, and free. From the corner of his eye, he could see his friend Fiona help the old man from the tub and tenderly pat his thin, naked body dry with an absorbent cloth. She helped him into his robe. Jonas thought Larissa had drifted to sleep, as the old often did, and he was careful to keep his motion steady and gentle so he wouldn't wake her. He was surprised when she spoke, her eyes still closed. This morning we celebrated the release of Roberto, she told him. It was wonderful. I knew Roberto, Jonas said. I helped with his feeding the last time I was here, just a few weeks ago. He was a very interesting man. Larissa opened her eyes happily. They told his whole life before they released him, she said. They always do. But to be honest, she whispered in a mischievous look, some of the tellings are a little boring. I've even seen some of the old fall asleep during the tellings when they released Edna recently. Did you know Edna? Jonas shook his head. He couldn't recall anyone named Edna. Well, they tried to make her life sound meaningful. And of course, she added primly, all lives are meaningful. I don't mean that they aren't, but Edna, my goodness, she was a birth mother, and then she worked in a food production for years, till she came here. She never even had a family unit. Larissa lifted her head and looked around to make sure no one else was listening. She smiled. I don't think Edna was very smart. Jonas laughed. He rinsed her left arm, laid it back into the water, and began to wash her feet. She murmured with pleasure as he massaged her feet with the sponge. But Roberto's life was meaningful, Larissa went on. After a moment, he had been an instructor of 11s. You know how important that is? And he'd been on the planning committee. And goodness, I don't know how he found the time. He also raised 2 very successful children, and he was also the one who did the landscaping design for the Central Plaza. He didn't do the actual labor, of course. All right, we're going to stop there because we're already at 15 minutes, so we are at the top of page 37 after that first paragraph. So I will see you tomorrow.